The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of distant insects, and Danielle Ross pushed through the double doors of Cedar Creek Medical's trauma unit at 6:22 a.m. on a Tuesday in August, her badge clipped to borrowed scrubs that still smelled like the manufacturer's plastic. 8 months. She had been here 8 months and no one had asked her real name yet, which meant no one had tried to find it, which meant the Pentagon's erasure had worked exactly as intended. The Hindu Kush operation had been buried so deep that even the VA database recognized nothing when they ran her credentials, no record, no service number, no echo of Captain Danielle Ross in any system connected to the Department of Defense. She was a ghost on a hospital ID card, and ghosts did not ask questions about things that might wake the living. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and yesterday's coffee. Danielle moved through the corridor with a stride that had been trained out of her in places where stride could mean the difference between invisible and dead, each step deliberate but unmarked. The trauma bay was already breathing, ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, monitors beeped their steady affirmations of survival, and somewhere deeper in the unit, a resident was explaining yesterday's case to a cluster of interns who looked like they had never missed a sleep cycle. Danielle had missed exactly 247 of them. She knew how to count them. She knew how to function on the other side of them. She moved to the supply station and began her rounds, checking crash cart inventory, verifying medication codes against the digital logs, catching a missing dressing change order that someone else had already forgotten to flag. The work was muscle memory, the kind that did not require thought, which meant it did not require her to be anything other than what she appeared to be, a competent nurse with steady hands and no history. The faded unit patch was still sewn inside her jacket lining where no one would see it, where the thread had begun to fray at the edges from 8 months of being worn in the locker, folded and refolded against itself like a secret that had learned to fold back. Dr. Pierce arrived during morning rounds like a man who believed the air pressure changed when he entered a room. He was tall in that way money builds tall, expensive shoes, tailored coat, watch that cost more than most residents made in 6 months. His voice carried the particular texture of someone who had been told he was brilliant so many times that he had stopped thinking and started performing. Danielle was hanging a fresh unit of O-negative when she felt him stop near the nursing station, felt the weight of his attention shift toward the trauma monitors where she had already repositioned 3 lines that had been inserted with the precision of someone learning from YouTube videos instead of experience. "This is our new nurse," Pierce said to a resident named Chen who had been fumbling with a femoral artery assessment for the past 15 minutes. "Ross. Ms. Ross, was it?" He did not wait for confirmation. "Why did you reposition the A-line on bed 3? The resident had it placed perfectly well." Danielle did not turn from the 4 bag she was securing. "The resident placed it at 42 degrees. Optimal assessment at 30 degrees. The numbers were wrong." "The numbers were within acceptable range," Pierce said, and she heard him smile, heard it in the way his voice flattened out before it rose again, the vocal equivalent of a predator testing the fence line. "Do we need to discuss the hierarchy of medical decision-making?" "No, doctor," Danielle said, and turned to face him with a composure that felt like ice water running backward through her spine. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds before she returned to her work, the message complete: "I heard you. I understand you. I will not break." He laughed, a sound like a dismissal, like she was a piece of equipment that had made an unexpected noise. When he walked away, Chen exhaled slowly, and Danielle knew in that moment that at least one person had seen what just happened. The resident had registered the calculated calmness in her voice, the absence of deference, the way she had corrected a doctor without flinching or apologizing. That was a problem. Visible competence was manageable. Visible competence without visible fear was something else entirely. The morning continued with the rhythm of a hospital that had learned to function despite its flaws. Danielle moved through patient rooms, through documentation, through the 1,000 small decisions that kept people alive when their bodies had begun the process of dying. She caught a medication error in a standing order, vancomycin dose calculated for a 200-pound man on a 140-pound woman, a mistake that would have caused renal damage within 72 hours. She flagged it quietly to the attending physician, who thanked her and corrected it, and Danielle realized immediately that her courtesy had made the correction visible, had made her competence public in a way she had not intended. By 2:13 p.m., word had moved through the unit like a current. The new nurse caught things. The new nurse noticed. The new nurse asked questions about why phantom surgeries appeared on charts for patients who had never been to surgery, why certain device suppliers appeared with unusual frequency on surgical invoices, why insurance claims were being filed for procedures that existed only in billing codes. These were not the kind of questions people asked casually. These were the kind of questions that made people disappear. Room 347 held a Navy captain named Marcus Holloway, and when Danielle entered to change his dressings around 3:38 p.m., she found him staring out the window at the San Antonio skyline with the distant focus of someone looking at a memory instead of a view. His chest was mapped with blast scarring, the kind of terrain that told a story about insurgent ordnance and the precise moment when fortune decided to betray you. The scars ran deep, deliberate, the kind that marked the difference between dead and alive by an arithmetic of millimeters. When she moved closer to begin the dressing change, Danielle's breath caught for exactly 1 moment before she controlled it entirely. His left forearm bore a tattoo in military script, Ross. Just her name. Nothing else. No rank, no unit, no context, just the 4 letters that identified her, that marked her as someone he had known well enough to carry on his skin forever, and whose name his traumatic brain injury had erased from the catalogue of memories that made him human. She said nothing. Her hands moved on their own, practiced and steady, as she peeled away the old dressing and began assessing the wound beneath. Holloway's eyes slid over her face like she was transparent, like she was part of the hospital architecture instead of the person whose name he wore. She worked in absolute silence, noting the granulation tissue, the clean edges of the healing blast wound, the precise lack of infection that suggested someone had been changing these dressings with military competence from the beginning. She had done this before, in caves and desert tents and the backs of helicopters. She knew the work. "How's the pain level?" she asked, and kept her voice low and professional, the voice of a nurse instead of the voice of someone who had dragged him through gunfire while mortars were falling. "Manageable," he said, and turned his head away. She finished the dressing change and documented her assessment, everything normal, everything healing, everything proceeding according to the timeline that trauma surgeons used when they wanted you to understand that you were going to survive this, that your body had been given permission to keep functioning. As she was leaving the room, Holloway spoke again, his voice thin and distant. "Do I know you?" he asked, and Danielle stopped in the doorway but did not turn around. "No, Captain," she said. "You don't." She walked back to the nursing station where Pierce was reviewing charts with the intensity of a man protecting something, and Danielle understood in that moment that his competence was not clinical, it was financial, institutional, networked. He was the kind of doctor who had learned to make money move through the hospital system like blood through arteries, and her questions about phantom surgeries and device suppliers were not theoretical concerns. They were threats to an operation that had been running long enough to become invisible, to become routine, to become the kind of thing that no one asked about because everyone had already decided not to look. She needed to disappear before he decided to make her disappear. Grand rounds happened every Thursday at 7:13 a.m. in the Cedar Creek Amphitheater, and Dr. Pierce had choreographed this one like a surgeon planning an incision. 50 residents sat in descending rows of seats, the kind of audience that laughed when the chief of surgery wanted them to laugh, that nodded when he nodded, that took notes on every word because notes became exam questions and exam questions became careers. The fluorescent panels above cast a white glare that made everyone look slightly corpse-like, appropriate for a room where reputations came to die. Danielle stood at the back near the exit, her badge clipped to her scrub pocket next to a trauma shears and a faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the kind of thing no one noticed because no one looked. She had learned in the Hindu Kush that the safest place in any room was the one nobody was watching, and so she stood in the corner where the light didn't quite reach, where her stillness made her invisible. "Today we discuss dangerous nursing," Pierce announced, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man about to perform a public execution. He held up a patient chart, Danielle's chart notes written in her precise handwriting. A series of interventions that, while well-intentioned, demonstrate exactly the kind of cowboy medicine that gets patients killed. The residents leaned forward. Pens moved across notebooks. Pierce turned the chart sideways, reading aloud, Patient on post-op day 2, vitals elevated, respiratory effort shallow. I initiated prone positioning without physician consultation. He looked up, his face arranged in an expression of concerned disappointment. Prone positioning. Without waiting for an order. Without asking permission. A resident in the third row made a note. Another whispered something to the neighbor. The ripple spread. This nurse, Pierce continued, gesturing toward the back of the room where Danielle stood, believed her 20 minutes of observation trumped 40 years of surgical training. This is what happens when nursing becomes confused with medicine. This is the mentality that kills people. Security stood by the double doors, hands relaxed, watching. Not threatening yet. Just waiting for a reason to threaten. Danielle's breathing stayed even. The room's temperature was exactly 69 degrees Fahrenheit, and she knew this because she had learned to catalog environmental data the way a sniper catalogs wind speed and elevation. She did not blink. She did not shift her weight. Her hands remained at her sides. We will all do better, Pierce said, closing the chart with deliberate slowness, by recognizing the difference between a nurse and someone playing doctor. The residents applauded. Soft at first, then building. The sound of institutional agreement, of hierarchy reaffirming itself, of the understood rule that questioning the chief of surgery was career suicide. Danielle watched Pierce's face as he soaked in the applause. His shoulders relaxed. His jaw loosened. He had fed on something he needed, and now he was sated. The moment lasted exactly 4 seconds before she turned and walked toward the exit. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular mustiness of a space where people went to avoid being human. Danielle was reaching for the refrigerator when Pierce appeared in the doorway with an entourage of 3 interns trailing behind him like pilot fish following a shark. His hands were steady now, his voice loose and casual, which meant he had decided to enjoy this. Danielle, right, he said, using her first name like a weapon, like using it demonstrated a kind of familiarity that erased her. I've been thinking about your future. Or lack thereof. The interns laughed. Small, uncertain laughs that suggested they were still learning how to participate in cruelty. You know what the problem is. Pierce continued, moving closer, his presence pressing against the air like he was trying to occupy space she was breathing. You're wasted here. Cedar Creek's a level 2 trauma center. We see broken arms, appendectomies, routine post-ops. You need a more appropriate setting. Somewhere with lower stakes. Less liability. He paused, letting the interns catch up to the joke. I think you'd be perfect at San Antonio Animal Medical, he finished, his smile sharp as a razor pulled from a leather case. They see a lot of interesting cases. You clearly have the instinct for it. The interns laughed harder now. Bolder. Permission had been granted. Danielle removed her hand from the refrigerator and turned to face him. The light from the break room's single window fell across her face, and for just a moment Pierce's expression shifted, something in her eyes made him hesitate. But he recovered quickly, his smile spreading wider, his confidence reasserting itself like a habit too deeply grooved to break. Your hand shook through that entire femoral line yesterday, Danielle said. Her voice was quiet. Quieter than quiet. It was the sound of someone who had learned to deliver orders that did not need to be loud because they did not need to be questioned. The resident held the pressure, not you. Next time, I'll let the patient bleed so you can explain why. She stepped past him without waiting for a response, without acknowledging the interns, without breaking stride. His mouth had opened and closed like a fish, a sound that did not quite form into words, and by the time his face went white, really white, the color of someone understanding that they had just been assessed by someone whose judgment they could not dismiss, she was already through the door. The hallway was empty. 7:52 a.m. The day shift was still consolidating. The night shift was leaving. The transition moment when Cedar Creek Medical was neither one state nor another but something suspended, waiting. Danielle did not allow herself to feel anything until she reached the supply room and closed the door behind her. Then, alone among the cardboard boxes of gauze and sterile equipment, she pressed her palm flat against the cool metal of the equipment cabinet and let her breathing deepen. In through the nose. Hold. Out through the mouth. The way she had learned in a cave in Cuna province when mortar fire was eating the rock face above her, and the only thing that kept her alive was accepting that fear was just information, just data about what the body was doing, nothing more. By 8:15 a.m., Pierce had already made 3 phone calls. The first was to the hospital board president, a man named Harrington who had referred his nephew to Cedar Creek 5 years earlier and who owed Pierce favors from when Pierce had recommended the nephew's acceptance into medical school. The second call was to someone at a state medical board office whose name appeared in Pierce's phone as a license. The third call was to a woman who worked in credentialing, a woman whose daughter had received a recommendation letter from Pierce for a fellowship interview. The network activated quietly, like dominoes positioned across a landscape, waiting for the first one to fall. By afternoon, a preliminary review of Danielle's credentials had been initiated. By evening, someone at the credentialing office had noticed something odd: the references on her file, the ones vouching for her hospital experience before Cedar Creek, they seemed thin somehow. One had expired. Another was listed at a defunct clinic. A third reference check came back with a woman named Patricia saying, "I'm sorry, I'm not sure I can verify that employment. The dates don't match our records." Pierce had orchestrated nothing illegal. He had simply made 3 phone calls to 3 people who were already disposed to listen to him, and those 3 phone calls had set in motion something that looked entirely natural, like the system working exactly as it was supposed to work, like questions being asked and answers being sought and nobody doing anything wrong. By the time Danielle finished her shift at 8:22 p.m., the first formal inquiry had been submitted to the hospital's Human Resources Department. By 11:04 p.m., it had been assigned to an investigator. By 2:33 a.m., while Danielle sat alone in the employee break room watching the coffee maker cycle through its heating elements, that investigator was in an office in downtown San Antonio reading through a file that had been flagged as urgent credentialing concern, and he was making his own phone calls and asking his own questions, and each question was knocking the next domino. Danielle stared at the coffee maker's digital display. The numbers ticked forward with mechanical precision: 2:34 a.m. 2:35 a.m. 2:36 a.m. The network was working. Not because Dr. Pierce was visibly doing anything more. Not because he had made another phone call. But because he had positioned the first domino carefully enough that gravity was handling the rest. She had taught herself a long time ago that there was no point in watching the dominoes fall. There was only the work that came next. The cardiac monitor shrieked once. Then fell flat. Room 347 erupted in sound, the ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, alarms screamed in the kind of pitch that stops blood, and the Navy captain's body convulsed as the pressure in his chest crushed his lung closed. Danielle was there before anyone else registered movement. The dressing change had been routine. Vital stable. Then something shifted. A fragment, old and metallic, working free from scar tissue after weeks of slow migration through damaged muscle, and now it had found the lung. Tension pneumothorax. The kind that killed fast. She called for a thoracotomy tray. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped. "Get me a thoracotomy tray. Now." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway like a man summoned by smell of blood. Behind him came Kemper, Orozco, 2 surgical residents, and 4 others, the network, the allies, the watchers. His face arranged itself into something resembling concern, but his eyes were calculating. Danielle didn't notice. She was already moving, already assessing. The captain's O2 sat dropping fast, his skin turning the particular shade of gray that meant minutes, not hours. "Stand down, Ross." Pierce's voice carried the weight of authority. "This patient is non-salvageable. His O2 is 72 and falling." "I said stand down." Kemper stepped forward. "His DNR. Family called this morning. We're managing symptoms only." "A lie?" Danielle had seen the chart update, DNR status was nowhere in the system. But the lie hung in the air with the weight of institutional certainty. The other doctors said nothing. They simply turned. One by one, they left the room. Not quickly. Not with drama. Just the slow, deliberate exodus of men who had decided this was not their fight. Orozco walked past without meeting her eyes. 7 others followed. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them all like insects at a funeral. Danielle locked the door. She moved to her personnel locker, the one she kept in the back of the supply room, under a hoodie that hadn't been washed in 6 months. Her fingers knew exactly where to find the seam. The jacket lining, reinforced with something heavier than fabric. Inside it, sewn with military precision, was a faded unit patch. 3rd Battalion. And beneath the patch, wrapped carefully in oilcloth the color of old blood, was a combat knife. She pulled it free. The handle fit her palm like it had been waiting for her hands for exactly this long. "You're going to need a knife." Her sergeant in the Hindu Kush had said that. 2 weeks before everything went wrong. 2 weeks before the operation that got buried so deep that the Pentagon issued orders for her to disappear, to erase herself so completely that not even the VA database would know she'd ever existed. In a cave with mortars falling and nowhere to go but through, you're going to need a knife. She was back in room 347 before the monitors finished their second alarm cycle. The captain's chest heaved once. Danielle moved with the kind of economy that comes from having done this before, not on a training dummy, not in a simulation center, but on a bleeding man on a cave floor while Taliban fire chewed through the rock overhead. She didn't think. Muscle memory took over. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser. The blade went in at the left anterior chest wall. She opened the cavity with movements that were absolute, that knew the exact angle between the ribs where blood vessels lived and where they didn't. Pain was information. Pain was data. The captain's lungs expanded in that terrible moment before consciousness fled, before the body understood what was happening. The knife worked, found the bleeder, clamped it with her fingers while she reached for the chest tube, not with her hands, not with her voice, but with the particular calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The air hissed. That sound. She knew it. The hiss of a lung re-inflating. The hiss of pressure equalizing. The hiss of a man coming back from the edge. O2 sat, 68. She repositioned. Clamped. Worked. 72. The bleeding slowed. Stopped. 79. Another resident had cracked the door open, seeing something they didn't understand, and Danielle didn't order them to leave. She simply didn't give them permission to stay. They left anyway. 85. The chest tube went in smooth as prayer, and Danielle's hands stopped shaking. Not because she was calm. Because she was done. Because the work was finished and adrenaline had one destination only, stillness. 88. 92. Sinus rhythm. The captain's heart climbed back into normal range, and for the first time in 90 seconds, the only sound in the room was the ventilator breathing for him and the steady, civilized beep of a heart that had decided to keep beating. Danielle stepped back. Her scrubs were soaked. The blade was still in her hand. She looked at it like someone greeting an old friend at a funeral, the kind where you don't smile, you just nod and understand that some bonds don't break with time. A nurse had cracked the door open minutes into the crisis. She saw Danielle's hands. She saw the knife. She saw the captain's chest rise and fall with the kind of precision that only comes from someone who has done this when the ceiling was made of rock and the floor was made of blood. The nurse didn't say anything. She just closed the door and went to find the ICU team. What happened next would change everything. But Danielle didn't know that yet. She was still standing there in room 347, watching the captain's vitals climb toward normal, watching his tattoo, her name, Ross, inked in military block letters on his left forearm, rise and fall with each mechanical breath. He didn't know her. Traumatic brain injury had stolen that. Time and war had taken the rest. But her name was still on his body. Written in ink. Written where it couldn't be erased, even if the Pentagon had ordered her to disappear. Even if 10 doctors had turned their backs. Even if the world had decided she didn't exist. The nurses arrived for transport, and Danielle helped them transfer the captain to ICU, careful with the lines, careful with the tubes, careful with the precision that had bought him another 72 hours on Earth. As they wheeled him out, his eyes moved across her face and found nothing. No recognition. No memory. Just a nurse doing her job. Just a stranger who happened to know how to save his life. Pierce's phone was already in his hand before the monitors flatlined. 1 hour. That's all it took for a man who had spent 23 years building an empire of silence to activate every favor he had ever collected. He called the hospital board president first, a man named Bancroft who owed Pierce $300,000 in deferred consulting fees and the kind of gratitude that only comes when someone helps you bury a malpractice settlement. Bancroft answered on the second ring. Pierce didn't waste words. We have a credential fraud situation. Nurse Ross. I need her gone before this becomes a liability. The board president didn't ask questions. He asked for documentation. Pierce told him there wasn't any yet, but he was working on it. He had already made the second call while walking to his office, to the staffing agency that had placed Danielle 8 months ago. A woman named Rebecca Chen answered, and Pierce's voice took on the tone of concerned mentorship. I'm not trying to cause problems, Rebecca, but I need to verify some references for one of your placements. Captain Danielle Ross. The name felt wrong in his mouth, like he was pronouncing it in a language he didn't speak. Captain. That word had slipped out of someone's mouth during the code, and Pierce had heard it, filed it away. Now it was a thread to pull. Rebecca's voice changed. She was no longer friendly. She was defensive. I'll need to check the file, Doctor. Can I call you back? Pierce heard the hesitation, the sudden awareness that something was being questioned. He had learned long ago that the moment a reference coordinator needs to check a file is the moment the file has a problem. He pressed. Quickly would be better. We're concerned about patient safety. That phrase opened every door. Patient safety. 2 words that made board members nervous and investigators interested. By the time Pierce made his third call to the State Department of Health Services, the machine was already moving. He had a contact there, a medical investigator named Morris who had testified in 2 of Pierce's malpractice defense cases. Morris owed him more than gratitude. He owed him money. Not officially, of course. There was never anything official about these things. Pierce framed it perfectly. I have a nurse working under what I believe are fraudulent credentials. She performed a procedure tonight that she was not qualified to perform. If something goes wrong with that patient, this hospital could face serious liability. Morris said he would open an investigation immediately. By midnight, the machine had swallowed her whole. Security arrived at the trauma bay while Danielle was still charting the captain's vitals, still noting the oxygen saturation at 94% and climbing, still recording the exact moment when a dying man had become something close to stable. Officer Garrett, who had always treated her with respect, who had never questioned her presence in any part of the hospital, stood in the doorway with an expression like someone carrying bad news they didn't want to deliver. You need to come with me, he said. Danielle set down her pen. She didn't ask why. She had known the moment Pierce's hand touched her shoulder before the code was even called, had felt the current of his rage like an electrical charge in the air. She had saved a captain's life, and in doing so, she had made herself impossible for him to ignore. The walk to her locker took 6 minutes. Danielle counted her steps like she always counted things, methodically, turning data into something manageable. The corridors of Cedar Creek Medical stretched out like a cathedral she was leaving, the fluorescent lights overhead bleeding white onto tile that suddenly felt temporary under her feet. Nurses she had trained looked away as she passed. Not all of them. A few met her eyes, Rodriguez with her jaw tight, Keisha with something like anger in her face, Thompson who mouthed I'm sorry. But most of them looked at the wall, at the floor, at their charts. Danielle didn't blame them. She had been a ghost before. She could be a ghost again, Her badge was still clipped to her scrubs when she opened her locker. Everything inside was exactly as she had left it that morning: a spare pair of scrubs folded with military precision, a worn copy of a pharmacology reference, a plastic lunch container with 3 almonds, and a piece of string cheese she had forgotten about 3 weeks ago. And there, inside the jacket hanging in the back, the one she wore only on cold days, the patch was still there. Faded now, colors bleeding into each other like a watercolor left in the rain. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. The embroidered letters had lost their edge. Her hands were steady as she reached for it, as she pulled the jacket from the locker. "Your badge," Officer Garrett said quietly. Danielle unclipped it. The photograph on the front showed a woman with the same face but a different life. That woman had blue eyes that knew nothing. Danielle set the badge on the locker shelf and closed the door. She didn't lock it. There was nothing inside worth keeping now. The rain had started while she was inside. It fell in sheets against the ER bay doors, hammering the concrete in a rhythm that matched her pulse. Danielle walked through it without an umbrella, without hurrying. The hospital lights reflected off the wet pavement like a city burning underwater. She could hear sirens in the distance, other people's emergencies, other people's lives breaking in ways they didn't choose. She thought about the captain for a moment, about the way his oxygen saturation had climbed: 72, 80, 89, 94. Each number a small victory. Each breath a second chance he hadn't known he was getting. Officer Garrett walked beside her to the edge of the parking lot. "For what it's worth," he said, "you're the best thing that ever happened to this place." Danielle didn't respond. She couldn't. The words would have come out wrong, shaped by anger she couldn't afford to feel in front of anyone who could report it. So she nodded once and kept walking toward her car, a gray 2004 Civic with 83,000 miles and a cracked windshield, parked in the same spot it had been in for 8 months. Route 90 was empty at 3 in the morning. The diner was called Marge's, and it had been open since 1987 according to a sign in the window. Danielle sat in a vinyl booth with a view of the parking lot and ordered coffee from a waitress who didn't look up from her notepad. The coffee was exactly what it looked like: brown water that had been sitting in a pot for 6 hours. Danielle held the cup anyway, let the warmth drain out of it slowly, watching the reflection in the window glass. The woman staring back at her had Danielle's face but someone else's eyes. She looked like a ghost that had forgotten it was dead. Her hands, which had held a man's ribs open and kept his lung alive, shook slightly as she lifted the cup. Not from fear. From rage. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was restraint. It was the specific kind of violence that lives inside people who have learned not to move. She pulled the jacket from the bag beside her and laid it on the table. The patch was barely visible in the diner light, just a darker shadow on darker fabric. Her thumb traced the outline of it, the way she had done 1,000 times in bathrooms and empty cars and hotel rooms she paid for in cash. 3rd Battalion. That meant 247 people. That meant a captain with her name on his arm who didn't know her face. That meant a command structure that had decided she was worth more as a phantom than as a person. The coffee went cold. Danielle watched it, the surface of it stilling like a mirror, and she thought about throwing the jacket into the parking lot. She thought about walking into Route 90 and flagging down a semi and asking the driver if he was heading anywhere that wasn't here. She thought about the captain in room 347, about the way his lungs had filled again, about whether he would live long enough to understand what his life had cost. And then she heard it. A sound that didn't belong on Route 90 at 3 in the morning. Faint at first, then growing louder. Not a siren. Not a truck. Something rhythmic, something military. Danielle's head turned before her mind caught up. Through the diner window, she could see the horizon tilting. 2 pinpricks of light, then 4, then 6. Approaching from the south. The sound resolved itself into something her body recognized before her mind did. Helicopter rotors. Danielle's hand closed around the jacket. She didn't move. She just sat in the vinyl booth and watched the lights get closer, and she didn't let herself believe anything was coming to save her. Because salvation, she had learned, was a story people told themselves. And she had stopped believing in stories a long time ago. The hospital board meeting had convened an hour earlier. Pierce sat in the conference room with his hands folded in front of him, a man who had never doubted his own power. Bancroft was reading through Morris's preliminary report, the medical investigator's notes on Danielle's credentials, the concerns being raised, the phone calls that hadn't been returned, the references that had suddenly become impossible to verify. Everything Pierce had set in motion. Everything that would end her. Pierce had already drafted the termination letter. Violation of protocol. Performing procedures outside her scope of practice. Credential fraud pending investigation. He would have her name erased from Cedar Creek Medical's payroll the same way the Pentagon had erased it from their records. She would be a ghost in both places, real and unreal simultaneously. The board members nodded as Bancroft spoke. Nobody asked the question that mattered. Nobody said, "But how is the patient?" Nobody mentioned that a man had come back to life because of what she had done. In a place where money moved like blood and favors were the currency of survival, those facts were irrelevant. It wasn't until a nurse came in with an update, the captain had stabilized completely, vital signs improving, they were moving him to the ICU, that anyone looked up. And it wasn't until later, hours later, that anyone would understand what had already begun moving in the darkness outside this hospital. By then it would be too late. By then the wheels would already be turning. And Dr. Pierce would finally begin to understand what it meant to have set a trap for someone and discovered, too late, that he was the one inside it. The monitors screamed. That was the only sound the room held for 6.3 seconds before the captain's eyes snapped open and his hand shot out like a reflex that had spent 18 years waiting for this moment. His fingers clamped around the wrist of the resident checking his vitals, and his voice came out rough, fractured by sedation and time, "Valkyrie." The resident froze. Two Marines standing outside his door went absolutely rigid, hands moving to their phones with the synchronized precision of men executing a standing order. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3 down the corridor. Radio static crackled before anyone spoke. The room pressure changed. Within 20 minutes, a staff sergeant in dress blue stood at the foot of the captain's bed with a citation trembling slightly in his hands. He cleared his throat. The words came out measured, ceremonial, the way sacred things are spoken aloud, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in the Hindu Kush, Captain Danielle Ross, United States Navy. He paused. Someone in the hallway exhaled. Bronze Star. Another pause. The citation paper rustled. Silver Star. The sergeant's voice dropped lower. 2 Purple Hearts. His jaw tightened. The Marines outside the door exchanged a single glance. And a Navy Cross. The silence in room 347 became the kind of silence that has weight. Dr. Pierce burst through the door screaming before the sergeant could fold the citation. His voice cracked across the walls like a whip, words colliding, fraud. Fabrication. She has no credentials, no license, no history. This is some kind of Pentagon cover-up, some classified. He stopped mid-sentence because a 2-star general had arrived unannounced and was now standing in the doorway with the kind of presence that makes oxygen feel negotiable. The general's eyes moved to Danielle, still in her civilian clothes, and his gaze dropped to her left shoulder where the Navy Cross scar was visible beneath the neckline of her shirt. A thin white line. The geography of survival. The general's hand moved to his chest and he saluted. A full, formal salute. Medals that she had never been allowed to wear in public, that existed only in redacted files and buried records, suddenly presented in front of 50 witnesses on a hospital floor. Pierce's face drained of color like someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again, but no words came because the general was still standing at attention and the staff sergeant was holding a Navy Cross citation and the captain was gripping Danielle's hand with the intensity of someone whose memory had finally aligned with reality. It took exactly 90 minutes for the video to go viral. Dr. Pierce screaming at a decorated captain while a 2-star general saluted in the background. The footage spread across social media, news networks, hospital forums, military pages. Within 4 hours, his own medical school mentor, a retired Navy surgeon who had written Pierce's letter of recommendation 28 years ago, saw the clip and made a single phone call to the hospital board president. His voice carried the kind of authority that comes from having actually served. "Remove him or I pull the endowment." $53 million walked toward the door. The board voted in real time. By 7 a.m. the next morning, Dr. Pierce was no longer chief of surgery. By noon, his license was under federal review. By 3 p.m., FBI agents in dark suits were walking through Cedar Creek Medical with their own questions about phantom surgeries, kickback arrangements, and insurance claims that didn't match any procedures performed. They found everything: the coded conversations with the device supplier, the falsified billing records, the list of Navy veterans charged for operations that never happened. 68 patients. $240,000. A career built on the assumption that no one would ever check, and a Navy captain who couldn't remember her because traumatic brain injury is indifferent to gratitude. 6 months later, Danielle ran the veteran trauma unit she had built from nothing. The unit had protocols for treating combat-related psychological injuries, specialized training for blast trauma, a 24-hour psychiatric liaison. 83 Navy veterans had already passed through those doors. The hospital board had added a full VA wing and established a pro-veteran scholarship fund. The gift came from a general who had recommended her for the position of Chief of Trauma Surgery, a title she declined. She stayed in scrubs instead, checking vitals, teaching residents, holding the hands of people who had survived things that shouldn't be survivable. In room 347, during physical therapy on a Tuesday afternoon when the light through the windows was the color of honey, the captain gripped her hand while his other arm extended, muscles still rebuilding themselves after months of stillness. His fingers traced the letters of her name on his arm, slowly, like reading Braille. Ross. The tattoo had faded a little over the years, but not much. His eyes met hers, and this time they held recognition, not just the ghost of it. "You came back," he said. Simple. Not a question. "Never left," Danielle replied. "Just had to become visible first." 3 blocks away, in a commercial plaza off Blanco Road, Dr. Pierce moved boxes of latex gloves and blood pressure cuffs from a loading dock into a white medical supply van. His name tag read, Steve. Customers sometimes glanced at him and recognition flickered across their faces, but they never said anything. Once, someone called him doctor and he flinched hard enough that the blood pressure cuffs went crashing to the pavement. He didn't work there anymore after that. The van pulled into a different lot now, a strip mall urgent care in Tucson where nobody knew his name, and that was exactly how he wanted it. At night he drove past the hospital where his reputation had lived for 28 years and felt nothing but the weight of the difference between being known and being erased. Danielle's reflection in the hospital window was no longer a ghost. She stood in the trauma bay reviewing intake assessments, her voice carrying authority without needing to raise it, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had learned medicine in caves with mortars falling. The tattooed name on the captain's arm was no longer a phantom connection. It was a living proof that some sacrifices are finally recognized, that the quietest people in the room might be the ones holding everything together, and that the Pentagon's silence could be broken by something as simple as a Navy cross and a 2-star general with a spine. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. So here's the question: if you discovered that someone you judged as inadequate, as a risk, just a nurse, had been saving lives the entire time, would you have the courage to admit you were wrong? Or would you spend your whole life running from the truth? Subscribe for more stories of hidden strength and impossible reckoning.